Great, lovely to be here. We do have a vacancy in the UK if anybody wants to lead for the next few months. So, dear President, please come and help us. So, I'm sure that everyone in this room already buys into the idea of large longitudinal population studies, so I'm not going to dwell on that promise at all. What I am going to do is talk about how together we could advance a collective vision to deliver that promise, but also to make sure that we can exceed, I think, what we've even set out to do. This meeting was set up to exactly enable that collective vision. So I'm really excited that I get the great job of outlining an ambitious target and then watching you all go away for the next 2 days and work together about how you're actually going to achieve it. And that, I have to say, is one of the joys of being a research funder, is that you can set these visions and you don't actually have to do the work. So thank you. So what is this vision? And I have to warn you that this is not all about genetics. The vision which our Welcome strategy sets out to achieve, but which I think many funders around the world also subscribe to, is about all longitudinal population resources, whether or not they have genetic data. The genetic data just makes them more valuable. So the vision is a globally connected network of large cohorts with multidimensional data from representative samples and diverse populations. No easy task. And secondly, that those resources are maximally exploited by scientists all around the world, and the results are used to improve health. So these ambitious visions are all very well, but as we all know, the process of achieving that vision is hard, it's hard fought, and is multiple steps which need to happen in order for that vision to be achieved. So I'm going to spend the rest of this talk outlining 6 areas which we feel are critical areas which we need to progress in order to achieve the vision. So as I've said, a breadth of resources with representative samples, high quality multidimensional data across the life course within individual resources, linkage and interoperability across resources, discoverable, accessible and widely used resources, meaningful stakeholder engagement to improve the quality and the impact of the resources, and improve strategy for translation of the findings from those resources into real health impact. And I'll go through each of these in turn. So this is, I think, the hardest one, getting a breadth of resources with representative samples from diverse populations. Now, Iceland is obviously sorted because you've included every single person in your country, so that's amazing. In most countries, that simply isn't possible. And as we know, collecting large representative samples is logistically extremely difficult and very, very expensive. So we need some innovation in how we get representative samples in our populations. There are 3 major risks to not doing this. The first is that, as we know, and as many of us are working against, genetic research is largely focused on white Northern Hemisphere populations. And the risk is that that will not lead to interventions which will benefit most people globally. And I know that lots of you are working to combat that. And there are great examples like H3 Africa, which are really leading the way in showing how it can be done. There are equal concerns, secondly, about the risk of data misuse, of data collected from populations in lower middle income countries in particular, which could be used to develop interventions which benefit high-income country populations but are not affordable in the global south. And again, these are risks I highlight that I know you know and you're combating, but they are risks we should be aware of. And thirdly, as the resources become ever more valuable, they also become ever more widely used, and the risk of misusing the results from those resources increases. So the example of UK Biobank, I'm sure Rory won't mind me using, they're very, very clear that Biobank is not a representative sample. The death rate is about half of that of the UK population. And they have clear guidelines saying you must not use these data to generate incidence and prevalence rates. But the temptation to generalise the results from Biobank to far wider populations is huge because the data are so valuable. And we must guard against that. And of course, the more diverse and representative our data are, the more useful they become, because we have the breadth of social, biological, behavioural, cultural data, and all of those risk factors to relate to health outcomes. Those results become much more useful, and if you can generalise them, they become much more impactful. So how do we get a breadth of representative resources without spending billions of pounds? And the answer is we don't know yet, but we have to try. I think some of the things we can do is prioritise funding new resources in populations where we do not have data, and that is something that funders can do. We also need to fund existing resources to boost their samples to become more representative, which is again something that funders can help with. And we also need to ensure that we have better methods for getting representative samples, quicker, cheaper methods, but also embedding public trust in the research process and in data collection into our resources so that more people who are asked to participate will say yes. And lastly, we need to interconnect resources, create a patchwork of global resources so that a few monolithic studies don't crowd out the diversity of smaller resources, which are often more representative and often have deeper data than these very large-scale resources can have. If we can link those resources into a global patchwork, then we can create diversity from what we already have. So the second pillar that we need to work towards is high-quality, multi-dimensional data across the life course. Now, a single resource can't be expected to collect birth-to-death data, but across a patchwork of resources, we can generate life course data. And my biggest plea, probably for the whole of the next 2 days, being an anthropologist turned epidemiologist, mental health researcher, is it's not all about the biology. We have to measure humans in their context. We have to understand their cultural, their behavioural, their social environments and risk factors, and to relate that to their biology. And if we do that, I think we can really make progress in improving health. But again, that's not easy because it's really expensive to collect huge amounts of data on individuals. And we have to capitalise on the data collection methods that we have, digital data collection, passive data collection through wearables, linkage to healthcare data and routine data. All of these multidimensional sources of data, we must work towards linking those to give a holistic picture of an individual. Thirdly, linkage, interoperability and analysis. We thought long and hard about whether to use the word harmonisation and decided that we would not be that ambitious, but we would talk about interoperability across resources. And that has 3 main areas. So we all know the difficulties of linking routine data into longitudinal data sources. In the UK, it's something we've struggled with a lot. The Nordic countries have been doing this much, much better than us for very, very many years, so we have a lot to learn. And we need to have better ethical and consent frameworks to enable the public to agree to link data from multiple sources, because it does make them much more identifiable. In terms of interoperability, then while data harmonisation is a gold standard we can always strive for, it's probably unrealistic with existing cohorts, because the historical inertia, the need for an individual cohort to measure the same variables in the same way over time to remain entirely valid, is absolutely the overriding force, and it becomes very difficult to ask cohorts to change their data, the measures that they're collecting, to have true harmonisation. But we can set data standards for the collection of biological samples, for the collection of clinical and phenotypic data, and for the data formats we use, and we can strive that new resources are harmonised with the best in class of our existing resources. And then lastly, do we need a collaborative sequencing strategy? The push for genomics is huge, it's incredible, it's incredibly expensive. And do we need to prioritise, for example, sequencing in populations where we don't have much data from? Do we need to prioritise exome sequencing over whole genome sequencing because of the economics? All of these are questions which I think this particular group has the brain power to answer. Of course, the economics of who pays for this sequencing will be a huge driver in whatever strategy could be agreed at a meeting like this. And then lastly, we need innovation in analysis methods, both for improving linkage and harmonisation across resources, but also in the analysis of these data, which we've ended up with these hugely amazing data resources, but how we actually validly analyse those data is a huge question. And artificial intelligence, machine learning has a huge role to play, but the jury is still out on whether the risks of poor reproducibility of results, because it's looking at patterns within the data set rather than patterns in the real world, is huge. And again, if we had diverse and representative samples, then the machine learning we did on those samples would be more generalizable to the real world. Fourthly, open access data. I think we have a duty as collecting huge amounts of data from the public to make those results open, accessible, and widely used, as is legally possible within the country in which the data are collected. As funders in the UK, we've been thinking about this a lot, and we've developed a registry of low and middle income cohorts, which is just starting. I think the vision would be a global registry that all cohorts were registered in to make them much more discoverable. Individual cohorts need to promote data sharing and open access within the remit of the setting that they're in. And that means that as funders and as a community, we need to encourage progressive national data access policies. Because if the legal frameworks don't exist, then we won't be able to share these data. Meaningful stakeholder engagement across a range of stakeholders, the public, policymakers, healthcare providers, industry, is absolutely critical to improve the quality of our resources. And that could be everything from meaningful bi-directional dialogue, return of results to participants, efforts to foster public trust in data and trust in experts so that the public are willing to contribute their data. And also, potentially, another thing that this group could think about is developing rules of engagement with industry. So we absolutely need industry. We have to work with them. They have the resources to pay for a lot of this. They have the ability to generate and scale up the healthcare interventions generated from these resources. But how do we engage with them in a way that doesn't endanger public trust and doesn't threaten the validity of the resources? And then lastly, improve strategies for translation of findings into health impacts. I think there hasn't been enough attention on this. There's a kind of assumption that cohorts are discovery science, but I think there are so many findings from cohorts which have direct relevance for clinical work, for preventing risk factors in populations, that we need a much clearer, stronger pipeline from the results of cohorts to translating them to health impact. And that could be increased funding by national governments to ensure that the resources in each country meet the needs of the policymakers in that country and ask nationally relevant questions, with a coherent policy to pipeline to policy and practice and early engagement. Iceland is obviously a fantastic example of this. Another great example is South Africa, where they've set up the South African Population Research Network, or SAPRIN, which is a national research infrastructure linking 3 existing health demographic surveillance sites and setting up 4 new surveillance sites. Totally will cover 500,000 people, 1% of the South African population. They're harmonising scientific protocols across these sites, they're linking it to routine data, and they will use it as an intervention platform to test government policies on healthcare reforms, as well as to generate a vast array of biological, social and clinical data on their population. So if we are going to achieve this vision, funders have a responsibility and researchers have a responsibility. And obviously policymakers also have. I didn't expect to have the President of Iceland in the room, so I didn't want to do one for you, I'm sorry, I wish I had. But in terms of most of the people in this room, funders have a responsibility to provide funding opportunities which support the delivery of that vision. And that means we need to ensure that there is a diversity of funding opportunities of the scale and the sustainability which you need to do these things. We also need to use our networks and influence to drive wider ecosystem changes, such as regulatory and ethical frameworks for data sharing, such as engagement with industry. But equally, you researchers have the responsibility to ensure that the vision is the right vision, that you sign up to it, to work in partnership with other researchers to share your data, to share your methods, to share your best practice, and to use your own networks and influence and brainpower to develop new and better and cheaper and more innovative methods to do all of these things. So we take this responsibility seriously, And a couple of years ago, we launched our longitudinal population study strategy from the recognition that we were funding in a very piecemeal way some resources which were huge, some which were quite small. We didn't have a cohesive strategy for these. And so Erica Pufal, who's sitting at the front, she leads Welcome strategy on this. And we've got three aims. The first is we want to drive standards in the field. So we want to fund the very best resources which generate world-class data which improve human health. But we want to do that by driving up the standards for all resources. So we fund according to 6 quality criteria, which are very, very similar to the 6 pillars that I've talked about to you today. And then we also want to enhance the value of resources. So we have a specific funding scheme for methodological advancements in this field, because we recognise that there are very few funding opportunities for developing new and better statistical methods for data linkage, for example. So we have a scheme for that. And thirdly, we commit to working in partnership with our fellow funders and governments to work towards this collective vision. So just in summary then, the kind of offer on the table that I would love to hear you debate and decide whether this would be a collective vision for the group is that we have a patchwork of diverse and representative resources across the world. Those resources contain multi-dimensional data and are linked and interoperable. They are widely used by researchers all over the world, not just in the Northern Hemisphere. They are linked to meaningful stakeholder engagement and ask relevant questions for the public and policymakers, and their findings are translated into health impact. Thank you.
As we're on time and we usually are behind, we have time for 1 or 2 questions if anybody has one for Mary. Terry?
Thank you very much for that. I don't think my microphone is on now. We probably should have had an introduction to microphones there, at least for me, but it's not working. So could you comment on your registry?
Just proceed.
We'll repeat the question.
Repeat it, yeah. Could you comment the registry that you're building of the low and middle income cohorts? We're actually trying to build a registry too, so
Perfect.
we should put them together. Is yours available somewhere? I kind of searched and
Yes, it is. So this is done with Joe McNamara from the EMOS. Yeah. So the question was, where is this online registry? And the answer is it was with IDS, Institute of Development Studies, and it's now at the website, and it's now moved. Has it moved already, Joe? So it's going to move to the UK. Basically, it is being developed, and it is on a website which is quite hard to find. So we're putting it on the UK's Research and Innovation website, which is the major research funders in the UK from the government. But it's small and it's incomplete. So I think if you have a registry, let's talk offline and talk about how we can make a single registry.
we have a team that's specifically doing it.
Perfect.
All right, thanks again.